to repeat again that tonight there will be a dinner and that shuttle buses will leave the hotels at 19:15 from each hotel. There is a dedicated bus, and each hotel is the LAM, the AC, Fataga, the Bull Astoria, and Cercotel. You need to bring your conference badge to the dinner, and we will be back to the hotels at 22:30. So please remember this, 19:15, there will be buses from each hotel going to the place of the dinner. Now, we continue with the work that we started this morning, and we are entering in one of the topics that had been already mentioned times, and this is information. How do we share information? How do we share information between the authorities, with the families, but also all the way around, how the families interface with the authorities in that multiple information exchange? I would add something else, and this is, we are in an era of immediate information. How do we deal with immediate information when at the same time the information has to be validated, especially in a very sensitive matter as an accident? The panel will be moderated by Francisco Moreno García. Francisco Moreno is the Vice President of the Spanish Academy of Science and Arts of Television. At the same time, is Director General of the Canaries Television. He is a journalist, but also he is a professor of communication in the business school, Next International Business School. I think we are in good hands. So, Francisco, in your hands, please. Go ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Me van a permitir que...
So if you allow me, I will develop this moderation task in Spanish because my English is very poor, and probably I wouldn't be able to ask the questions with the accuracy that I would need. So I believe that we are analyzing the situation of the victims and their families in air crashes. And from the information point of view, we are facing a significant disjunctive which is not unique in the air world, in aviation, that may also occur in different circumstances that may where we may have the collisions of two rights: the right to information and the right of privacy and honor of those who feel affected by the disaster and by the information that may be reported. So, and in this case of air crashes, with all the connotation of the financial interest, economic interests that are around of this type of disasters and crashes, but we have a significant informative interest, information interest, and the audience wants to know the answers, and also this air science will also want to know the answers why of the moment that is being informed. So for the science, for those who have to spread, have to disclose this information, we have to be conscious, the professional consciousness, and this should not become a dynamic which is also fostered by the competition between the media and what could be the audience, the amount of audience, the share of audience that you get have. So if you want to be the quickest one in spreading information, this may be causing a harm to the victims of the air crash. I think we have a both virtually and presently here. So they will have distinguish and understand the type of codes that we should establish so that both rights can be reconciled. And this doesn't happen only in air crashes. In the Canary Islands, we have been for 2 months and a half. We have been having the effects of a volcano, of a natural phenomenon that also has to do with science, and also we have the need to know from the science the phenomenon that is taking place. But we also have to be very conscious about the reality that we are telling, because the lava and is ruining those houses and properties, and also the families that are being affected, and this generates the significant impacts of the houses being destroyed. So we also have to combine science and consciousness. So because we have established the terms of this discussion, of this conversation that we are going to have in these terms, and I would like to give the floor to José Vicente García Santamaría. So we all know of the same coin, how they act. So last Sunday we were talking a little bit. We were talking about this speech of the lobbyists of the companies and the different interests that they have. So that were around, and something is about the first day and the impact that causes the disaster. That disaster causes, and then how after then, the right that is also being diluted, the right of the victims and their relatives and their families. And I think his point of view is very interesting. So I invite you to share your insights with us.
Good afternoon, everyone. For me, it's a great honor to be here. Voy a hacer esta presentación en español.
I'm going to make the presentation in Spanish, even though you have the PowerPoint in English, and I will also conclude in English. So, as I was saying, it's an honor, and I'm very satisfied to be participating in this symposium. And I really participate to get conclusions that we need, the conclusion we need in order to overcome the past mistakes that we have clearly made in the coverage of the accident of Bahía Spanair. So my first memory for the victims of the JK 5022 and the relatives and the families that have been working very hard for many years. The voice of these people, men and women, have been present for many years in order to remember us, to remind us about those who are not present, and they have been facing lonely the solitude and the loneliness of the courageous people. Why I have analyzed and why I have been working for over 6 months of my university life to discuss and to analyze the accident by Spanair. Why? Because to me it was a case study very relevant for different reasons. From the journalistic point of view or communication point of view, this show the structural problems of the Spanish journalism, how we work in journalism, and the methodologies that I use, also the lack of ethical frameworks, also the difficulties established by the authorities in order to restrict the freedom of the media. I say this was a unique as an exceptional case from the journalistic point of view, because it was a paradigm case of generation of information noise in order to somehow distort the truth of the accident, and it occurred in the absence of methodologies for action. It was also a strong battle of conflict of interest between different companies and institutions. So we had a lot of distortions intended to have an influence on the media, to lead certain lines of research, to modify the story, and to favor certain interests, or to privilege the experts that were most supportive of certain theses. So here you have 3 slides where I would like to summarize everything that happened during the first 6 months after this event. All the variables of the communication crisis, the actions and the consequences from the policy of the speakers developed by Spanair, the tools used with the affected people, and also the press conference that were held. Some of them was the statement, some of them were only to make a declaration but not to ask any questions from the media. Also, we had different elements of this information distortion. So, as you can see in this slide, you can see in detail, or I think you can see in detail, the actions by the big media, the mass media in Spain, the reference press in Spain, those journals that we had in Spain and with national coverage, but also the main communication media that were involved, the Prisa, Unidad Editorial, or El Periódico directly, the Periódico de Cataluña directly. What was the treatment of this disaster, of this air crash on television and on the radio? I would only show 3 samples of what happened. Firstly, it was leaked by the Ministry of Public Works. Also, the Director of Communication of the Ministry sent some journalists of this media some video. So this is a criminal action because it means revealing official secrets. So some hypotheses were created blaming or removing the responsibility of the airlines or the authorities. So you can see the information reality between August 2008 and December 2009. You can see from the very first week of the accident until December 2009. They have accompanied all the investigation over this time. So the tracing of initial hypothesis, we had many different hypotheses, and also the report of the CIA, which was what happened directly to summarize this general catastrophe, this general disaster. Some people have analyzed that this was not as serious, that some people think these journalists act. The problem was not in the media, it was for those who provided the media with information. But I think we have a liability, not only from the communication media, but also by the journalists. So even though many of the journalists at the very beginning could be my students from my faculty or people that had been working for a very short period as journalists, but I was surprised that they were so little trained to deal with the situation of these features. The general, I call this general disaster because we had little empathy for the victims and their families. And this was not the case with the 15th of March. And they didn't have a lot of coverage in the local media, but not in the big media in the country. And most of the media were occupied defending some specific interests. With few exceptions, there was a clear alignment of the main media with the official thesis of the investigation commission, and there was very little coverage of the survivors' testimonies. There was a big number of cross-interests represented by lobbyists, communication agencies, lawyers, politicians, etc., intending to, as in any crisis, as in any kind of crisis, was to have an influence on the media agenda, which is what happens in any crisis. And finally, the news provided by the general television station were very criticized by the internet users because they were doing what is being called like rubbish journalism. So they may have acted differently. The public television in Spain did not suspend the broadcasting of a friendly football match. It was a football match. And the private television station did not change. So the usual speakers were converted into specialists talking about an air crash. This is something that surprised all of us. So to conclude, I will only say two things. First of all, teaching for the media,
because they have no one to protect them. And second, listen to the victim's story so that the story of the powerful does not always prevail. No? Third, equip yourself with methodologies of action for crisis situations, and remember that the practice of journalism is always inquiry and research. Make a scrupulous selection of primary and secondary sources. Avoid the great deficit in the cross-checking of different sources. Application of ethical frameworks embodied in the ontological codes, capable of safeguarding the work of journalists. ¿No? Y simplemente otra cosa más, lo que...
And simply another thing, so what the Spanish disaster confirmed was the most corrosive journalistic system, the most pathogenic factor of credibility in the sector is the cross of the bad practice and the interests of the directors of the media. Thank you for your interest.
Bien, yo creo que hay...
So, thank you. I think you've really introduced some of the main elements that we need to be looking at here in the debate. I started with José Vicente because he's here, but I know we have Tim Heffer online, who's a well-known journalist from Reuters. He's worked there since '94, and he knows a great deal about air crashes and disasters, and particularly if we look at the manufacturers and the airlines. We know, for example, when the first Airbuses came online, and we know that obviously the aeronautic industry is very important, and we know that the airlines are involved, obviously, in these crashes, as are the manufacturers. So the floor is yours, whenever you like.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Santamaria, for that very interesting opening statement. I'm sorry I can't be with you in the Canary Islands, especially since that is such an important location in the history of aviation safety, and I'd like to pay tribute to all of the families involved in accidents there since 1977, obviously, and then Spanair. and all other accidents. And thank you for inviting me. I'd like to just tell you a little bit about what we do. I think I can respond to some of those very important and interesting points that were made, unless you want to come back to those, Mr. Chairman. But let me just say, as you mentioned, I'm a journalist, quite an old journalist now, so I've been around quite a while. And I would say about half my career, I've been covering aviation. Before that, I was covering other topics, business topics mainly. But I would essentially call myself a specialist aviation journalist. That's all I do. And there are fewer and fewer of us. There used to be quite a lot of aviation journalists. When I grew up in the UK, I think every paper had an aviation correspondent. Now you'd be lucky if they have a transportation correspondent. So it's a fairly small group of people. There are other types of journalists. Perhaps that might be, we're all journalists, so we're all accountable, but there are different types of journalists. There are aviation journalists who tend to understand the process of investigation, perhaps a little bit more. There are general media journalists. Nowadays, because of the economic pressures on the media, and there are fewer and fewer specialists, increasingly you will find that just a general reporter will be thrown into covering an accident. And we'll have to learn pretty quickly how accidents are investigated. Then you have the new media online, some of which are extremely good, very specialist contributions to aviation. And then, of course, you have general social media, which is a sort of mixture of everything. I think we all know about that. Here in Reuters, we are guided by certain principles. We call them the trust principles, which commit us to write with integrity, independence, and freedom from bias. That's the most important point. We try to be factual in what we do. We try to be accurate. Above all, we try to be honest. We will make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes, but when we make mistakes, we say so quickly and correct and make sure everybody understands what we've corrected and how. And above all, we try to be balanced in the way we cover these accidents and everything else. And it's very important, I've found, to certainly first and foremost respect the privacy of the families, not to practice intrusive journalism. There are many kinds of journalism. I won't say that it's all perfect, far from it. It's a very varied and diverse industry. People practice it in different ways. I can talk about the kind of journalism that we do that I think is practiced by many large news organizations. I don't know the circumstances of the coverage of Spanair. I wouldn't like to comment on individual performances. I presume that everybody involved has their own perspective on what took place. But what I would say is that for us, the challenge is to validate information which comes in a torrent now increasingly in the first hours or days. It's an extremely chaotic situation. I mean, beyond manageability, actually, as with social media reaction to almost anything. I don't think there's anybody in this industry who's mastered the challenge of handling that as smoothly as we might have done sort of 20 years ago. But, you know, it's something we're learning all the time. We're trying to keep pace with that. But the sheer sort of flood of information at the beginning can be very challenging. When we do write, I think it's important that we choose our words carefully. We choose our sources carefully. We try to get some sort of expert opinion, and you have to choose your experts carefully. There are an awful lot of self-appointed experts out there now. There are also experts who might have another agenda. For example, you increase law firms who might want to be quoted, might push very aggressively to be quoted by the media on day one when they really don't know what took place any more than we do. And that's because they want to have visibility to the families when it comes to choosing a lawyer for a potential case. Not all law firms, I might say, many are very reputable, but that is one of the challenges we face. So you've got to choose your sources, you've got to choose your informed experts quite carefully, and you've got to treat the information as carefully as you can. There is no perfect way of doing this. We always make mistakes. We always learn how to do it better. One thing I would say is, I think, as Mr. Santamaria put it very well, there are an awful lot of vested interests. This is an industry which is occupied by, it's a very concentrated industry, both in the manufacturing and the operating side. I mean, what are there, 800 airlines in the world? Well, that seems like a lot of airlines, but if you think of other industries, that's not very many sort of players in one industry. And then on the manufacturing side, of course, it's even more concentrated. You do have, why are we doing this? We're doing this because there is enormous appetite in the world, amongst the public, amongst the families themselves, of course, to know and understand what took place. And the sort of paradigm which maybe is the sort of purest way of looking at it, which would indicate that perhaps the world should wait and see it until it's been properly investigated, is very difficult to maintain in this information age. And that doesn't suggest any disrespect at all for the Annex 13 system. I mean, I'm actually a huge admirer of Annex 13, which is one of the most extraordinary international cooperation frameworks that's ever been created. But, the world moves at a different pace in parallel streams, and there is this enormous appetite for information. At the same time, there are an awful lot of very powerful people who want you to either say something or not say something. As I said, the industry itself is highly concentrated, and that gives rise to enormous financial stakes and power concentrated in relatively few hands. So these are organizations that have a lot to play for. You may well have political interests involved, governments, regulators, perhaps, who are under scrutiny. I heard with great interest earlier about the problem of learning from past accidents. That's something that we focus on increasingly. How were the lessons of past accidents implemented? If you think of the MAX, for example, I think perhaps we're moving towards that phase of the story now. Everybody knows what happened, but what is being done about it to make the industry more robust in future? So these are some of the things that we're looking at, some of the challenges we face. When it comes to the families, first and foremost, I totally agree with Mr. Santamaria. I mean, we're human beings too. Showing empathy to people who are suffering is just a basic human requirement, and it's something that I hope that all experienced and responsible journalists would do. Some families wish to speak to the media, wish perhaps to have their voice heard. Some don't. Some contact the media, some don't mind being contacted, some do. We try to navigate that as sensitively as we can. It's quite helpful for us when families eventually, when perhaps the dust has settled a little bit, have time to organize themselves into associations, because that gives us a sort of a framework to cooperate with the families with. But in the end of the day, we're not for anybody. We're not for the companies. We're not for the airlines. We're just trying to tell the public what happened in the most responsible way we can. There have been tremendous examples of how not to do it in the history of this industry, and I don't want to dwell on those too much, except to say that I sympathize with anybody who's suffered as a result of that. One way to avoid one of the things Mr. Santamaria mentioned, which is very important for Reuters, not just in aviation, but in everything we do, and other comparable news organizations, it's very important to ask yourself, when somebody gives you information or talks to you, why are they talking to me? Why are they giving me this? My very first editor in journalism said, just remember that nobody talks to you, they talk to your organization. It's a very good lesson. And sometimes people are trying to tilt the playing field in one direction or another by putting stories out through a particular organization. On occasion, that might be the only way that you can have access to what is, in any case, very important information that you feel that you need. So in that case, you need to identify the source as closely as you possibly can and try to explain in the story roughly whose agenda might be served by publishing this information and whose agenda, whose interest might not be served. So I think it's not just a question of which facts get reported when, but how they're reported, how you surround them by context, how you sort of cushion them against sort of speculation, or cushion the public against speculation by trying to explain, where does this come from? What does it mean? Why have I got it? And why am I telling you this? As long as you are as honest and transparent about that as you possibly can be, then I think, you know, you're probably on the right lines. We do make mistakes. People know who we are. They can write to us. I encourage anyone to challenge us if they think we're doing a bad job. On the whole, though, I think journalists who cover, especially who cover the subject permanently, are fully aware of some of the pitfalls involved, but also what a huge contribution to safety the global network of accident investigations has provided. And we hope to sort of coexist with that, and whilst remaining completely conscious of the terrible trauma that families are going through and their need to be heard. So I hope those thoughts are helpful, and with that I'll pass back to you, and happy to answer any questions at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Tim. And of course, later you can be a part of the discussion that we may have at the Q&A. So please speak for 10 minutes so that we can have time for the discussions for the Q&A that we may have. Now I will give the floor to Oti. Oti, she knows very well about the most human part that occurs in this type of disasters, more than about the financial interest. She knows about the emotional interest that occur in this situation. Otivo Edeke Abugarev. She joined Kenjun. Kenjun is a corporation in 2018 as a manager of humanitarian services. She's responsible for the humanitarian service for disaster, for the assistance to the survivors after the disaster. So she also manages the mental health system in the company. She has over 10 years of experience working as a specialist, as consultant in traumatic stress of this, and she is members of the UK Med, and she has significant humanitarian experience in Gaza, Tanzania, and Brasilia, and her testimony and words will be very significant and very interesting to all of us. So you have the floor.
Thank you. So I'm really going to focus on today about the management of data and incidences and how we choose to communicate as a community when we are responding to an aviation incident. So we know, as we live in an ever more digital world, that most likely it will not be our crisis management centres that will notify us of an incident. It will be a news anchor on the 9 o'clock news. So that inevitably restricts and limits the time that we have to respond and respond well to an incident. So what I'd like to propose today is a 3-point mechanism to ways in which we can organize ourselves to communicate, share, and protect data when an incident happens. Because we cannot control an incident, but we can control our response. So the 3 areas I'm going to focus on is 1, what we can do in the preparedness stage of an incident before it happens in order to organize ourselves to manage and protect data, what we do during an incident, and finally, how do we recover and build resilience after an incident has occurred. So before an incident. So we know that incidences are multifaceted, multi-agency, multi-stakeholder events. But what I want to try to convey to you today, my colleagues, is the idea that although we are multiple different agencies and stakeholders, we are actually responding to one incident, and we must do this in a united manner. So what I am trying to propose is the idea of sharing data, but in a more systematic and safe way. So we know that there will be an untold amount of data generated following an incident. But how do we share that data? How do we protect that data and communicate with one another? I think we should instigate a data management system that is holistic, that allows stakeholders to log into and share data with one another and communicate with one another on one platform. This will reduce the risk of disinformation and also confusion when we're all trying to respond to one incident. It also will allow us to have a more holistic view of what's going on the investigation arm, what's happening on the recovery of human remains and personal effects, what's happening with the response in terms of the care of families and survivors, so that we can actually give a direct communication to families and ensure that they're kept at the heart of our incident response. The second point I want to raise is about what happens during this response. So if we are going to establish a way of communicating in a more holistic, centralized way, how do we execute our response? The first thing I want to highlight is that I think there should be a level of restrictions placed on some data and databases that airline operators will have access to following an incident. I think that we need to have a mandated list and more guidance given to the air operator industry on what pieces of information needs to be immediately restricted. Things such as passenger manifests and passenger lists. No family member should have to find out via the news that their loved ones may be involved in an incident. Also, we need to think about our flight and cabin crew. Records such as their medical records and their training records must be protected immediately, because having that put into the public domain will often reduce the integrity of an investigation and also lead to families and survivors being unfairly targeted following an incident. I'd like to propose that we look at the JAFSTOC model, so the Joint Family Support Operations Center model, as a gold standard for which we organize ourselves. So how we centralize, ensuring that every stakeholder has a seat at the table and are able to communicate in real time with one another in order for there not to be any disjointed information. I think we can reflect back on incidences of the past where different stakeholders will come out with different statements or different findings from another arm of the response system, and that only leads to more distress and more confusion for families and survivors who are trying to understand what has happened to their loved ones following a response. I want to kind of highlight what we already know, that anyone with a mobile phone is a journalist. They have an incredible ability to share their opinions, their thoughts, their misinformation in real time on an international scale. So we need to have mechanisms in place and best standard practices in protecting the data that goes onto social media, but also, most importantly, protecting what the families may have to contend with information that is spread through that means. we also need to think about not only the protection of the digital space, but also protections of places like the site. So we're very good at getting security in terms of restricting access to the site, but what about what happens on the aerial aspects? We need to protect the airspaces with the introduction of things like drones, and obviously with journalists trying to get access to the site via helicopters. We want to be able to reduce the risk of people being able to take sensitive data, such as pictures of human remains and your own loved one's personal effects, and exploiting that on a global scale. We want to reduce the risk of that happening, and then ensuring that families don't have to withstand seeing their loved one's personal effects on social media. So when we're talking about social media, I think one thing that the pandemic has provided us with is this idea of digital spaces, of communicating with people who may not be with us right now via video conferencing, a bit like we're doing today. And I think we need to have best practices in how we provide virtual family assistance. We've always had families not able to travel, but during the pandemic, this has only increased. So how do we ensure that families can have access in real time? What I propose is that we have virtual spaces, family websites that are set up, are password protected, so families can feel safe enough to share information with their humanitarian support or SAT team members, and also be able to get information in real time, such as family briefings, see the site visit, and actually engage the memorial service from anywhere in the world. I want to touch upon the interesting topic of compensation. This is often where you see the fragility of the relationship between survivors and family and the air operators break down. This is an area that we consistently get wrong in our industry. We know that the Montreal Conventions give us some level of guidance, but what I'm proposing is that we have a step-by-step guide in terms of how to do this correctly. How do you structure your sympathy letters? How do you articulate to families about the initial payment, and that payment is a hardship payment rather than a final payment? I want to also lean on the insurance companies and our communication and relationship with them, because ultimately the final payment is calculated on a number of different factors, such as where someone's from, their living costs, their medical history, all goes into the insurance company's calculation in terms of a final payment. But what I want to stress to you is the protection of data, particularly around medical records. Families will give us medical records to help with the disaster victim identification process. They often will do that in order to help identify their loved ones. That data needs to be protected and not only be used for the identification of their loved ones, or indeed if it's important and imperative to an ongoing investigation. And finally, after an incident. So how do we build back better and learn from our experiences? And how do we as an industry actually learn from other people's experiences following an incident? I think there's a level of communication that needs to be had with organizations as us in the industry with one another. I feel that in order for us to grow and develop in our industry, we need to have solid frameworks around business continuity. How do you not only survive an incident, but how do you thrive after an incident? I think there needs to be more legislation and guidance towards that so that everyone can actually move on from an incident and continue to be commercially viable. One aspect I want to raise is this idea of internal communication. How do you galvanize and empower your employees to stand with you during an incident and stand with you as you start to build back better? This is something we need to start understanding and legislate and have guidance and best practices with. And so my concluding thoughts are really, I want there to be a set standard in which we communicate with one another, and I feel that as most of the data that we'll be sharing will be digital, we need to have a data management system that we can log into and actually share information between each other. I feel we need to think about how we safeguard information and have a good IT infrastructure behind us. And finally, to put families and survivors at the forefront and empower them in terms of the information that may go out into the public domain. So I know this quote has already been said before, but I want us to hold these words of Tim Hall into our hearts and minds, especially as we're on the first day of the symposium. And hopefully this will help streamline the way we decide to improve standards for families and survivors following an incident. And he simply says, all I have to do in this business of airline emergency response is ask, how would I want to be treated? But most importantly, how would I want my family to be treated? Thank you.
Gracias, Oti.
Thank you, Odi. Yes, this is obviously an aspect that we could go into in further depth. Yes, Alessandra Kaufmann, who's the Communications Director of the Civil Aviation Authority in the UK. She's been working there for... Well, she's been in this job since earlier on this year. And so she's in charge of internal and external communications, looking particularly in transport and strategy. She was had a role in the strategic development of Heathrow Airport, and she's held a range of different posts in nuclear programs, like Les Ponts. She joined Crossrail in 2019, where she worked as the Director of Communication. Well, with all this background, you're obviously a leader who's used to working in a context that's stuffed full of problems, with a very complex situation with a lot of political overtones as well. And she's an expert in relations with the media, crisis management, planning of campaigns, etc. I'm sure that she has a good knowledge of many of the keys that you need to be able to anticipate what may be happening. And I hope that her experience will help us to really be able to put the main protagonists right at the center of all of this, and they being the victims and the family members of the victims of aircraft disasters. So, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. I just wanted to say thank you very much for inviting me here today. And my thoughts and condolences to the victims, families and survivors of any aircraft incidents. And thank you for tuning in today through IKO TV. So thank you for that introduction. I'm going to give some brief remarks. Firstly, to introduce how the UK Civil Aviation Authority operates, because we operate a different model to most countries. And then also to talk about how we would react in a crisis, and just give some lessons that I've observed from working on a number of crisis communications, real-life incidents and crises exercises over time. I think the key to doing this is practice, practice, practice. Try to be as prepared as you possibly can. So, in the UK Civil Aviation Authority is an independent regulator. So we're set up very differently in the sense that we're not part of the UK government. So you have the UK government and you have the Department for Transport, which looks after all aviation and transport policy, as you would imagine. We're also not the authority that investigates an air accident. That's the Air Accident Investigation Branch, which is part of the government. So when the regulator, the Civil Aviation Authority, was set up in the 1970s, it was decided that there should be a really clear division between the investigating body and the regulator. So there is a publicly obvious distinction between the different organisations that would be involved. So the Air Accident Investigation Branch in the UK would be the first organisation on the scene. They would run the investigation. They would work with survivors and their families. They would be part of the government and provide spokespeople. They would publish information. We as the regulator would provide data facts supporting the AAIB. We would obviously help in terms of resources and provide information in terms of any safety data, but we have no direct role in the investigation itself. So what we would do is once a report had been published on an incident, we would then take that report and translate it into real-life safety situations. So the Aero Accident Investigation Branch would make a perfect world recommendation based on that one incident on its own. And the UK Civil Aviation Authority would then translate it into UK policy, work with European partners, work with global partners, to make sure that it's a realistic recommendation that absolutely can be translated in its purest sense. So we would absolutely ensure that there was a safety benefit that would be seen, not just in the UK, but we would make that recommendation globally. So moving on to when an incident would occur, we would very much assist the lead investigating organisation, but we wouldn't stay silent completely. It's very hard in a situation such as this for an organisation with aviation and civil in its title to not say anything. So we have a series of holding statements that we have ready and prepared, and to Oti's point, they're on a central management system that everybody in our organisation can see. My team can edit it, and we would make sure that we were directing internally and externally people to the AAIB. So we would effectively point them to their website. We would give them all the information to the AAIB, but we wouldn't be commenting directly other than recognising that an incident had happened. That's for a number of reasons. We're not the lead organisation in the UK, and our role comes into play later on. It's really, really easy to be drawn into speculation when these incidents occur, often when there's a lack of a story, there's lots of finger pointing that goes on, rumours start to happen. I mean, it's really, really important that organisations such as the UK regulator don't get drawn in on that speculation. The only information we provide must assist the investigation itself. We mustn't be drawn onto anything which might harm that. So the lessons that my team have learnt over the years, and there are four. The first thing is kind of going back to Tim's point and Oti's point that everybody is a journalist with a mobile phone that can film an incident, and within seconds it's on YouTube, news outlets are picking it up, and you're being asked as an organisation to respond. We must respond quickly. And I think what I've noticed is over recent years, certainly within the European sphere, we are acting quicker. We are responding quicker. We're not there was a time 5-10 years ago when it would be 12 hours before any updates would be put out externally. We can confirm an incident happened. We must explain the process we're now going to go through, and we must commit to giving regular updates. Even if we have nothing to say, it's better to say nothing than to not say anything at all. We mustn't speculate on the causes. We must talk about the process. The second point I would say is judge every single tweet as it comes in. Don't assume you know the background. Make sure you're thorough. You're going to have a small army of communicators, really, to kind of go through everything that's coming through. You mustn't ignore it. You must have a triage system, particularly with Twitter now. And obviously that's something that's building and building with social media. Linked to that, be prepared for the unexpected. there's never a plan that you could dust off a shelf which says this is exactly how this crisis is going to run. So be agile, be prepared, have a clear command system so that direction is coming to each of the teams. They know exactly what they're working on. That would be my best advice. And finally, it goes without saying, don't communicate anything that's going to compromise an investigation. It's going to slow things down. So be as concise as you possibly can, be as helpful as you possibly can, but don't stray outside of territory into speculation, because there are lots of lessons that we've learned, which means that that can slow things down in terms of getting information to victims and families in a fast manner, which has to be the absolute priority. So they are my observations, and I look forward to taking questions later. Thank you very much.
Bien, muchas gracias, Alexandra.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. So even though we have a pause, a break, I would suggest that because we only have two speakers left, so and then we can have the break later, and then we can have this discussion now. Teresa Cárdenas, a magnificent journalist from Spain. She specializes in civil